if you want to finish your transactions back there and your conversations and work your way into the sanctuary, that would be fantastic. And we're going to get tonight moving. So again, thank you for being here. My name is George Gray. I'm the pastor here at River of Life Fellowship. Throughout the next two sessions, the first one will be His Star. Second one will be an update on the James Webb Telescope. And then we're going to do a live Q&A. If you see me walking around, I've got this little pad with me. This is what contains all the questions for tonight for the Q&A. If you would like to add a question, just let me know. And here's a couple of things that have happened throughout today that are actually pretty funny. A couple of people have asked me, I don't know how to turn this into a question, but here's my thought. Can you make it a question? Actually, the third person who, there are three people who got me on that with that today. So I can help you phrase the question, or I'll just make up something really ridiculous and put your name on it. Which would be great. So if you have something on your mind, seriously, it's a good opportunity to ask that question, especially when we've got a resource as rich and understanding as Dr. Lisle is. Might as well take advantage of it tonight. We'll keep him here as long as we possibly can. It's fine. It's all good. No, we'll take him out and feed him at some point in time, but it'll be fine. Yeah, so we are going to get tonight right underway, and I'm just going to jump right out of the way. Dr. Lisle, come on up.
The star that led the wise men to Christ. And this is a question that often pops up, usually around Christmas time. People will ask me, what was that star, and is there a natural explanation for that? And those are good questions to ask. We always want to start with Scripture, though, and that's the key. So I'm going to try to answer this question as to what was the star that guided the wise men to Christ. Question we get quite a bit. It's really an exercise in hermeneutics, because what we don't want to do, what we're tempted to do and we shouldn't do, is to take what we think our knowledge is of science and things like that and then try to fit that into the text. That's not the right way to do it. We start with the text and see what it says and interpret it properly. And then we look at the science, and if there's a natural explanation, great, and if there's not, we let God be God, because God is not required to do things according to principles of science. He's beyond that. Science describes the normal way God upholds his universe, but it's not always the way God upholds his universe. So in any case, we're going to spend most of our time looking over the text and seeing what this star was. What does the text have to say about it? And then I do believe in what's called a ministerial role of science. Once we've established that we understand what the Scriptures teach, if there are some gaps, things that the Bible doesn't say, I think it's perfectly appropriate to use science to make some guesses to fill in some of those gaps where the Bible is silent. I think that's fine. We don't use science to override what the Bible teaches. That is the mistake that many people make. So this account is recorded in Matthew chapter 2. It's the only place it's recorded. As far as I know, there are not sources outside the Bible that record this event. This is unique to Scripture. It is a fascinating part of history. It's something that has fascinated me since I was a little kid, and I want to share my thoughts on this with you, and I hope this will be a blessing to you. I want to start by just reading the passage, the first 16 verses or so of Matthew chapter 2. We'll have it up on the screen, and then we'll go back through those verses and talk about them in a little more detail. So I think it's helpful to get the account in our minds so we can see all of it and kind of refresh our memory. I'm sure you've read it before, but it's helpful to refresh our memory on this. So Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw a star in the east, and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he began to inquire of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and make careful search for the child, and when you have found him, report to me that I too may come and worship him. And having heard the king, they went their way. And lo, the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And they came into the house and saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned by God in the dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their own country by another way. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. And he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, Out of Egypt did I call my son. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its environs, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had ascertained from the Magi. So let's back up now and go through these verses and see what we can learn about this star that led the Magi to Christ. So verse 1, we read that now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah, Bethlehem, of course, the birthplace of Christ. Bethlehem means house of bread. And, of course, Jesus is the bread from heaven. I love it when the Lord does stuff like that. And it's just neat. There's these play on words, and it's appropriate. It's history that only God could organize. And it's in the days of Herod the king. This is Herod the Great. And the thing you need to know about Herod is he was a wicked, wicked man. He had bribed his way into power. As far as we know, he's not a descendant of David. He's not a rightful king of Israel. He had bribed his way to be king of Judea. Judea was the remaining tribe of Israel that had survived. And you need to know that he executed his own wife and 2 of his sons. So he was not a particularly good father or husband. Of course, we know from these scriptures that he murdered every boy in Bethlehem and the surrounding regions because he didn't want a toddler to compete for the throne. He wanted to be king. He was king of the Jews, and he was not going to have a toddler compete for that, so he killed all of them. You have to be wicked to kill a 2-year-old. You really do, let alone all of them. That's wicked. Again, to give you an idea of how wicked he was, I do have to point out one of his own sons tried to poison him, so they didn't like him that much either, apparently. On his deathbed, he rounded up all the leaders of Israel and imprisoned them. He knew he was going to die. So he rounded up all the leaders in Israel and gave orders that when he died, they would be executed. That way there would be mourning in Israel over his death. Now, fortunately, that latter order was not followed. But that gives you a feel for how wicked this man was, that he's willing to slay a bunch of people just so he can be remembered. So that's the leader of Judah at the time that God sends his only begotten son into the world as an innocent baby into a nation that was led by a very wicked individual. It would make a great movie. I mean, just the suspense there of having this wicked leader, and then God sends this innocent child, effectively powerless, into this world. But of course, God is sovereign over history. It's not a problem for him. He knows exactly what's going to happen, and he decrees what's going to happen. So then these magi arrive. Magi, that's where we get our word for magic. These would be scholars of the ancient world, priests. They're from the east, the text says that, probably from the Persia area. Indeed, magi is the Persian word meaning priest. So we think they're priests or scholars from Persia. That was the area where Babylon, the area surrounding Babylon, and that's where they're from. And so here's a map of this part of the world, and so you can see Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Bethlehem and Jerusalem are only a few miles apart. They're within walking distance of each other, okay? So they're very close together. And then Persia, about 1,000 miles to the east of Jerusalem. So that's where we think the Magi were from. And what are Magi? We already mentioned they're scholars and priests. The Greek historian Philo describes the Magi as, quote, men who gave themselves to the study of nature and contemplation of the divine perfections, worthy of being the counselors of kings. So they would advise kings. These were the scholars of the ancient world. These were the PhDs of the ancient world. And kings, if they wanted to know something, they would consult the Magi. If they wanted to know when the next solar eclipse was, they would consult the Magi. If they wanted to know something about science or chemistry, they would consult the Magi. The Magi were the scholars. They were very knowledgeable of astronomy. That will come into our conversation because they're the ones that followed this star. They were astronomers. Of course, in the ancient world, astronomy, I mean, when you think of astronomy, you might think of Saturn or something like that. In the ancient world, astronomy was all about how things moved in the sky, especially the night sky, but the sun as well. How things moved and being able to predict how things move. And for the sun and the moon, it's relatively straightforward. I can tell you tonight the moon will be in a waxing gibbous phase, and it's probably already up now. When you go out tonight, you'll look at in the south and you'll see the moon there, and I can tell you about when it's going to set. The moon's easy. Planets are harder because we're on one of them, and we're orbiting the sun, and there's other ones. And so the Magi probably would have been able to predict, to some extent, the motion of the planets. They didn't get it down very well until much, much later, but they would have been knowledgeable about that. They would have been knowledgeable of all the sciences. Back then, you could be knowledgeable of all the sciences because much less was known. Today, to get a PhD, you can't just get a PhD in science. You have to specialize in a field of science and usually a specific subfield because so much is known today. But these ancient scholars would have known the basics of astronomy, chemistry, not in the modern sense of knowing about atoms and molecules, but they knew if you mix this substance with this substance, you'd get that reaction. They would have known that kind of stuff. The Magi were wealthy, and they had their own massive library, and so they would have been worthy of counselors of kings. And they could be called upon if there was a dispute as to who should be the rightful king. The Magi could be called in to settle that dispute. If some nation said, we're not sure if this person should be king or this person, the Magi could be called in and they say, you're the king, you get out. And they had their own personal army. They had thousands of soldiers. They could enforce it. They were wealthy. So these were powerful people in the ancient world, capable of deposing kings and settling matters of that sort. So these Magi come from the east and arrive in Jerusalem. How many Magi? Well, you've seen the Christmas cards. We know there's 3, right? And there's the song, We Three Kings, but the Bible doesn't say. We know there's at least 2 because the word Magi is plural. So there's at least 2. Magus would be singular. So there's at least 2 of them, but there's probably many Magi because there were many as a matter of historical records. There were many of these. And so again, this Christmas card picture of 3 people riding on camels, through the desert or whatever. No, there would have been a massive caravan. They would have traveled with their own army for protection. The Christmas card picture is not right. And frankly, they wouldn't have been on camels. They would have been on horses. The Persians were accomplished horsemen. They would have been riding Arabian horses. It was only if you were very poor that you would have a camel maybe. But again, they were not poor. They were wealthy. And we know that from other records. So that's the situation, is you have these Magi, these scholars of the ancient world who have power. They are called upon to settle who's the rightful king. And they're headed to Judea to see this one born king of the Jews, and they're not looking for Herod. And Herod's thinking, wait a minute, I'm king of the Jews. You could imagine why he might be troubled when this group of people who have the power to depose kings and are traveling with their own personal army are coming to his town looking for the king of the Jews, and they're not looking for him. You can see why he would be troubled. It's very significant that Matthew records men from the east following the star, and not Jews. These men from the east, they're not even part of Judea, and why are they looking for the king of the Jews? That's interesting. But the Jews are not looking for the king of the Jews. There's no record of anyone other than these Magi seeing or following the star. Most of the Jews missed it. And of course, we know as a matter of historical record, most of the Jews rejected their own Messiah. A few of them embraced him. The disciples, of course, were Jews, and they embraced the Messiah, 11 of the 12. So it's an ironic thing that Gentiles, not Jews, were looking for the king of the Jews. See, that's an indictment on Israel. And Matthew is full of that kind of irony. Matthew is honest enough. He himself is Jewish, but he's honest enough to point out the majority of Jews were in sin. They were not looking for their own Messiah. They were concerned about their own matters. They weren't looking for God. It was Gentiles from a pagan nation. They're from Persia. Persia, is the region surrounding and including Babylon, which was a wicked city in the ancient world. It was the city that captured Judah at one point. And it was these Gentiles that were searching for the king of the Jews, not the Jews. Very ironic. Matthew is full of that. If you take a look at some of the other indictments on the Jewish, especially the Jewish leaders, who should have been the first to welcome Christ, and they're the ones that wanted him dead. And you'll see all kinds of these ironic statements in Matthew. It's in Matthew that Jesus overturns the tables in the temple. He's upset about how the Jews are handling the religious ceremony there. They had become thieves rather than honoring God. There's the fig tree. Jesus came to the fig tree. God made the fig tree to produce fruit, but it wasn't producing fruit. So Jesus cursed it and said, "You're never going to produce fruit again." And it immediately withered. And by the next day, it had withered away. Interesting. And the Jews understood that. Oh, that's us, the nation of Israel. We should have been producing fruit. We should have welcomed the Messiah. But when he came, we weren't producing fruit. And Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom is going to be taken from you and given to a nation producing the fruit of it. There's the parable of the landowner. Remember the parable of the landowner? There was a landowner, and he had servants that were working the field. He went away, and he sent other servants to collect from the servants working the field. But what did they do? They stoned one. They killed another one. He said, "I'll send my son. They'll respect my son." And then when he comes, the son comes. This is the heir. And they kill him. And Jesus asks, what will the landowner do when he comes? And the people rightly answer, he'll put those wretches to a wretched end, indicating that, and of course the landowner represents God, who sent prophets to Israel and they murdered them. He's finally sent his son, and they're going to murder him as well. What will God do when he comes to Israel? He'll deal harshly with them. He will deal harshly with them. And that's when Jesus says, this gospel of the kingdom is taken from you and given to a nation producing the fruit of it. That's the church. God used the rebellion and sin of the Jews, the majority of Jews, to bring salvation to the Gentiles, for which I'm very grateful. And then the Bible indicates that when God pours out his blessings on the Gentiles, it makes the Jews jealous, and many of them turn to Christ. So it's interesting. God can use even sin for his glory. That's not to say we should go out and sin. But at the same time, that shows how awesome God is to be able to do that. And Matthew is the one that records these things. In Matthew 23, Jesus gives a scathing indictment on the religious Jewish leaders at that time. Woe to you, Pharisees, and so on. Your house is being left to you desolate. Your house. Normally, the temple is God's house. But in Matthew 23, Jesus says it's your house. Because God's not there anymore. He's left. You're done. And of course, in Matthew 24, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. Not one stone will be left on another that won't be overturned, which of course happened in AD 70. So, Matthew is the one that records more than the other Gospels. Each Gospel specializes in certain things, and Matthew's the one more than any that shows the rejection of the Jews of their own Messiah. But Gentiles from a pagan nation embrace him. That's what we get in these Magi. So what an indictment. The Magi apparently had some knowledge of the Bible. They must have been, if they knew the king of the Jews had been born. How did they know that? That's kind of interesting. Well, of course, Judah had been captured by Babylon about 500 years before these events happened. And so they would have had knowledge of Judah. They would have had knowledge of the scriptures. The Magi had a massive library, and they had captured Judah at one point. They certainly would have had the Old Testament canon, or at least most of the books of the Old Testament canon. They would have had that in their library. And frankly, Daniel, you might look this up later, but Daniel chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, Daniel was a Magi. He was one of the Magi. In fact, he was chief of the Magi, chief of the magicians. It's the same word, or in Aramaic anyway. So Daniel was their leader at one point. Now, this was 500 years earlier. But Daniel predicted the coming of the Messiah. He, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, but I think Daniel's the only place in Scripture where the timing of the coming of the Messiah is predicted. Remember the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Those are not weeks of days, they're weeks of years. Literally 77s, which would be 490 years. That's when Daniel predicted. From the issuing of a certain decree to the coming of the Christ or the Messiah being cut off would be that number of years. And so Daniel was the one that predicted it. He was the leader of the Magi at one point. Undoubtedly, he passed on that knowledge. They certainly would have had Daniel's book in their library. He was one of them. So they knew when the Messiah was going to come because they had that prophecy and they understood it apparently. So they would have had some knowledge of the Bible. Very interesting. And they arrive in Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting. They don't arrive in Bethlehem. They arrive in Jerusalem. Interesting. And from that, I would infer that the star was not guiding them at that point. They had already seen the star in the east. They arrive in Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? Well, if the star's not guiding them, they from Persia, if they're seeing a star that's guiding them, it's guiding them toward Judah. 1,000 miles away. But when they get there, the star's not guiding them for whatever reason. Maybe it had faded. Maybe they had a string of clouds and they couldn't see it. And so they're thinking, well, it makes sense to go to the capital city, right? The king would be in the capital city. That would make sense. That's normally what happens. And so it makes sense that they would arrive in Jerusalem. And what do they ask when they get there? They ask, where is he who's been born king of the Jews? Not if the king of the Jews had been born, but where. They already knew he had been born. The prophecy had been fulfilled in Daniel. They knew the timing, and they'd seen the star. And somehow they recognized the star as indicating the birth of the Messiah, of the king of the Jews. How they knew that, that's tricky. We'll come back to that. But apparently they knew that he had been born, and they're looking for where. They don't know where. Now, the Bible did prophesy in the Old Testament that he'd be born in Bethlehem. That's in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But they may not have been aware of that. They might not have had that book. They might have only had some of the scriptures. You know, we take for granted we have all of the Bible today. You probably each have your own copy. That is a blessing in our modern time. That's rare in the ancient world to have your own copy of something. Before the invention of the printing press, if you wanted your own copy of something, you had to make a copy or pay somebody else to copy it hand by hand. So in any case, they might not have had that. So they're looking for him who's born king of the Jews. For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. We saw his star. That's where I get the title of this. It's something that is uniquely the Messiah's. All stars belong to God, but there's something special about this one that signifies it as the Messiah's star. Interesting. What could that be? What could that be? We'll come back to that. Is this a particularly bright star? Because you see on the Christmas cards, I mean, it's just glowingly bright. But no one else saw it. Herod was unaware of it. He had to ask them when they'd seen it. Herod was unaware of it. No one else seemed to know where the Christ child was. Apparently, only the Magi saw this star. And that tells me either it's something supernatural that only they could see, or it wasn't particularly bright. It was unusual in some way that the Magi, being astronomers of the ancient world, they would have caught it as unusual, but most people would not. That tells me it's not particularly bright. So that's another of those Christmas card misimpressions that we get that's really not in the text. For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. This phrase has bothered me for many, many years. When I was a kid and read that, and I'm thinking through what that means. They're from the east. It said that earlier. The Magi from the east, they came, and now they say, we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. There's sort of two ways you can interpret that. I think the most natural way is to say, well, we saw his star in the east in the sense that the star was in the east. But then why did they go west? Right? Persia is already east of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So why did they go west? You could interpret it as when we were in the east, saw his star. Right? We saw his star when we were in the east. You could interpret it that way, but I have to admit that's less natural. The more natural interpretation is we saw his star. The star was in the east. The question is, what does the phrase in the east refer to? Does it refer to the men, the Magi, or the star? And context seems to suggest it's the star. So that bugged me for a long time when I was a kid. You know, we saw his star in the east and decided to go west. Right? Weird. And it continued to bother me until I looked it up in the Greek. Because the literal Greek translation of that phrase in the east is actually at its rising. We saw his star at its rising. And in fact, the ESV and the NLV both translate it that way. We saw his star at its rising. I would be hesitant to, if all the English translations translate it that way, I'd be hesitant to apply a different translation. But when you have two perfectly good translations that give a different translation, that suggests that might be the better. That's literally what it means, at its rising. Why did they translate it in the east? Well, the sun rises in the east. The moon rises in the east. The stars rise in the east, and they all set in the west because the earth's spinning the other way. And the ancients knew that. They knew that everything in the sky rose in the east. And so rather than having a separate word meaning east, to say you're going to the east, you'd say I'm going toward the rising. And people would understand that. I'm going toward the rising sun. Okay, that's east. And if you're going west, you're going toward the setting. That makes sense. That's how they would say east and west in the ancient world. And so normally, it wouldn't matter whether you translate it at its rising or in the east, because if it's in the east, it's rising. And if it's in the west, it's setting. And vice versa. If it's rising, it's in the east. So normally it doesn't matter. If you say, I went toward the rising sun, you're going east. If you say, I'm going east, you're going toward the rising sun. Same thing. But I am going to suggest that this star was very unusual. This may have been the one star that rose in the west from their perspective. And that they would recognize as unusual. That they would recognize as unusual. Because from Persia, so if you're in Persia and you're looking west toward Jerusalem, and you see all the stars would be setting there. If one star rose, you'd say, that ain't right. That's something that you would never see in the ancient world. Today we see it quite often because we have artificial satellites, and artificial satellites will rise in the west sometimes because it saves energy to go in the same direction the Earth's already rotating. But in the ancient world, there were no satellites. So to see a star rise in the west is something that the Magi, the astronomers, would have recognized as something that just doesn't happen. But how would they associate that with the Messiah? And I want to suggest that they were probably familiar with Balaam's prophecy. This is a prophecy in Numbers 24, verse 17. It says this. It's a messianic prophecy. It's referring to the coming of the Messiah. It says, a star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. So it refers to this star, or it's poetic parallelism. The two statements are to be interpreted as a unit. It indicates that a king is going to rise to power in the land of Israel, or Jacob, right? One of Jacob's descendants will rise to power, indicating a star or a scepter. A scepter is what a king holds. It represents the king. But I'm going to suggest that it has a secondary literal meaning, that a star literally will rise over Israel. And that is something that you would never see except by a miraculous power of God. So you could imagine these ancient astronomers looking west, seeing all the stars setting over Israel, where they knew Israel was, and one star rises over Israel. They're thinking, that's impossible. But wait a minute, I remember reading something about a star rising over Israel. And they turned to Numbers 24:17, and they recognize that's a messianic prophecy. It refers to the coming of the Messiah. So now, you can... the Bible doesn't say that they were familiar with that. That's my... I'm inferring that, but it's a reasonable inference given that they were scholars of the ancient world. They would have had that text. So I'm suggesting that they saw this star rising in the west where no natural star would, and recognized that in light of Numbers 24:17 as a fulfillment of a messianic prophecy, an indication that the King of the Jews had been born, this ruler who was going to come forth from Jacob. And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. I've already suggested to you the reason why Herod would be troubled. He knows that the Magi can settle whether or not, who the rightful king is. They're called upon to settle that matter, and they have an army to enforce it. And they're coming to Jerusalem, they're looking for the king of the Jews, and they're not looking for Herod, who thinks he is the king of the Jews. So you could understand, he might be concerned that they were there to depose him, and he doesn't want to lose his power, of course. What is sad is that all Jerusalem was troubled with him. And I just thought, how like us? These inhabitants of Jerusalem, they should have been thrilled when they heard the King of the Jews has been born. This is something that the Israelites had been looking forward to. God's people had been looking forward to it for 4,000 years, ever since God promised that one of the descendants of Eve would crush the head of the serpent. That God himself, Yahweh, would somehow enter into humanity and deal with the problem of sin. That had been prophesied. And it would be a descendant of Abraham. It would be a descendant of David, the Messiah. They'd been looking forward to this. And how many people desired to see the Messiah and never saw him? They had faith in him, and God counted that faith as righteousness. Abraham had faith in God, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. But most people of the Old Testament were looking forward to the Messiah, and they never got to see him. And finally he comes. It's the time. This is the generation that will see him. But rather than being excited about that, they're troubled because they know it's going to be a political mess. They know that their current wicked king is going to be upset by this. And so they're troubled with him. And again, that made me think of how we get all upset about politics today and forget that God is in control, and that if a wicked person rises to power, which may very well happen in this next election, and yes, that'll cause problems. It may cause economic collapse. But you know what? God can use disaster to bring people to repentance. If you've been praying for this nation to repent, this might be what you've been praying for. Something to think about. So Herod's troubled. And so what does he do? He gathers together all the chief priests and scribes of the people. He began to inquire of them where the Christ was to be born. He doesn't know either. He knows the Magi are asking where this king of the Jews is to be born. He doesn't know either. But he thought, you know what? I'll get some information. I can give them and I'll trade information. I'll get some information from them too. So he asks his own scribes, the Jewish scribes, and they know because they are familiar with Micah chapter 5, verse 2. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. They're referring to Micah. And then they quote Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And you can look that up in Micah 5:2 as well. And by the way, if you do look it up in Micah 5:2, you'll see the wording's a little different. And if you're wondering about that, it's because they are quoting the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Micah, whereas your Bible in Micah translates directly from the Hebrew. So the wording will be slightly different, but the meaning's basically the same. The indication is that in Bethlehem, that's where the Messiah was to be born, in the house of bread. I think that's pretty neat. And they don't quote the whole verse. The rest of the verse says, his goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. I love that. That's just cool. The Bible indicates that this Messiah who's going to come forth from Bethlehem, who's going to be born in Bethlehem, has always existed from the days of eternity. It's one of those passages that might have been very perplexing to Old Testament believers. How is it that someone who has yet to be born has always existed from the days of eternity? See, we know the answer to that as New Testament believers, because Jesus Christ is God. He's always existed as God, but he came into the earth as a flesh and blood human being. He didn't cease to be God, but he took on human nature as well. The New Testament answers that. But Micah 5:2 is a further proof of the divinity of Jesus Christ. He is God because he's always existed. His days are from the days of eternity. Then Herod secretly called the Magi. Not publicly, secretly. He doesn't want to do it publicly. He doesn't want people to warn the Magi that, by the way, you shouldn't go to Herod. He is wicked, and you don't want to have anything to do with him. So he calls them secretly and ascertained from them the time the star appeared. That tells me he hadn't seen it. He had to ask them when they saw the star, and apparently they told him. And the interesting thing is, it was actually some time ago, because we'll find later that Herod has all the male children under the age of 2 slaughtered from the time he had ascertained from the Magi. So it was actually probably over a year ago, something like that they had seen the star rise. Remember, they had to make a 1,000-mile trip. And so this is another one of those nativity misconceptions. You'll see the wise men at the nativity scene. They were not at the nativity scene. They were there much, much later, probably a year later, assuming Herod's probably going to round up to 2 years just to cover his basis, but it could have been a year and a half that they had, because it might have taken them some time to figure out what the star meant. When they first saw the star rise over Israel, and a star rising in the west, that's weird, but I've read something about a star rising over Israel. It might have taken them time to find the passage in Numbers 24:17. It took them time to make preparations for the trip, and it's not just 3 of them. They're traveling with a caravan. So it took time to make that journey. So they're not there at the nativity scene. In fact, when they arrive at Jesus, he's living in a house at the time. He's not there at the manger scene. And furthermore, I can prove that they weren't there within the first 40 days. Because if you read the text in Luke chapter 2, verse 24, 40 days after the birth of a male child, they're supposed to have the child dedicated in the temple, and they offer a sacrifice. And they're supposed to offer a lamb and a pigeon or turtle dove. That's the required sacrifice for a male child 40 days after the birth. But according to Luke 2:24, Joseph and Mary offered 2 turtle doves. Why? Well, why didn't they follow biblical law? They did. There is an exception in biblical law. If you are too poor to afford a lamb, then according to Leviticus 12:6-8, if you're too poor to afford a lamb, you can sacrifice 2 turtle doves. That's why they did it. They were poor. But wait a minute, when the Magi met them, they offered gold, frankincense, and myrrh. If Joseph had had gold, he'd had plenty of money to buy a lamb. So you see, it had to happen after the 40 days, and probably quite a bit after that. So it's interesting what you can learn when you read the scriptures carefully and apply that and kind of say, because of this and this, we have to conclude this. So the Magi came after that, after the dedication. So Herod sent them to Bethlehem, because he gave them that information. He learned from them when the star appeared that told him how old the child would be, so it'd be under 2 years old. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make careful search for the child, and when you have found him, report to me that I too may come and worship him." Now, of course, he's lying. The Bible is very clear that Herod intended to kill the child, and God makes that clear to Joseph later on. So he sends him to Bethlehem. He had ascertained from the scribes where the child was to be born. And having heard the king, they went their way, and lo, the star which they had seen in the east, or literally at its rising, went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. Now, this is important because this tells us that they saw the star on at least 2 occasions. They saw the star at its rising, and then later, and that was before they met with the king, because remember, Herod asked them when they saw the star. So before they met with Herod, they'd seen the star. And then after they met with Herod, they saw the star again. And this time, it went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. This is the one place where the Christmas cards get it right, because I think the star literally hovered over the house, because it's what it says. It stood over where the child was. Apparently, it directed them to the very house they were supposed to go to. They already knew he was in Bethlehem. Herod told them that. It moved to the house that he was staying in at the time. Remember, Joseph was a carpenter. He might have found work in Bethlehem. He might have been there for a year or two after the birth, before they eventually go to Nazareth. So the Magi see the star again and follow it to where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And that one again perplexed me when I was a child until I realized, wait a minute, they wouldn't have gone to Jerusalem except the star had abandoned them for a while, for whatever reason. String of clouds, whatever. They were not seeing the star when they met with Herod. Otherwise, they would not have had to ask him where to go. They would not have had to stop in Jerusalem and say, "Where has he been born King of the Jews?" They could have continued to follow the star. And it might have been several weeks that they had not seen the star. They might have been discouraged. They might have thought, did we misread the signs? They might have thought, has God abandoned us? Were we following the right object to begin with? Because we're here and nobody seems to know, did we misread the signs? And then finally they see the star again. Oh, and it's close now. It's close, they can tell. Because it stood over where the child was. So you could imagine why they would rejoice with exceedingly great joy. They know that God is with them, and they're very close to their goal. They're close to seeing the face of God in human flesh. And they came into the house, not the manger scene. They came into the house and saw the child, not the baby, different Greek word. They saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. To worship means to bow down. It can either mean bowing in respect or it can mean religious worship. I don't know for sure which is implied in this passage, but I think it's probably religious worship. My suspicion is they knew that they were meeting their Creator. Can't prove that from the text, but they did open their treasures and presented him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Those are significant because in the ancient world, when one nation would conquer another nation, sometimes they would allow the subservient nation to continue to have its own local government and perhaps even a local king, provided they paid tribute. Rome allowed that. Rome allowed nations to keep their own kings in many instances as long as they continued to pay tribute. And so the lesser nation, the vassals, would give tribute, including gifts like gold, frankincense, and myrrh, to the superior nation. It's a way of saying, I'm king, but you're the king of kings. And so the fact that the Magi did this suggests that they knew who they were dealing with, the king of kings, not merely the king of the Jews, but the king of all kings. And you can read about those gifts, by the way, if you want to, in Genesis 43:11, 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 2, where inferior nations will give gifts to superior nations. It's prophesied in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 6, I love this, that Gentiles would bring gold and frankincense to the Messiah. So it's another fulfillment of prophecy, God prophesying 700 years in advance of what would happen. Gold is also mentioned in Psalm 72, verses 10 through 15. So it's really an amazing account, and now we have some idea of what this star did. It apparently rose, and they saw it at its rising. They saw it when it rose. I'm going to suggest it rose, from their perspective, in the western sky over Israel, and so that's the way they go. Rather than in the east, it's literally at its rising. And they apparently were not seeing it, so they arrived at Jerusalem, capital city. Makes sense to find the King of Kings there. They meet with Herod. Herod tells them, no, this Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. And he asks them when they saw the star, and they say, something a little less than 2 years ago, something like that, because he uses that time frame to slaughter the innocent children. And then after they meet with Herod, they see the star again. And this time they're very happy because they're very close, and it leads them to the location of the Christ, apparently the very house. They already knew he was in Bethlehem. They didn't need to follow the star there. Herod told them that much. And then they give their gifts. And so now that we understand the text, now we can use science in a ministerial role and try to make a guess about what this object was, providing it's consistent with the text. I have to point out that the Greek word for star, aster, that's where we get the word astronomy, study of stars. It really is more broad than the specific astronomical definition of a star today, which we would say is a ball of hydrogen gas self-sustained by nuclear fusion. Okay, the ancient word would be more broad than that. It would include what we would call stars, like the stars in our night sky, but it would also include things like planets. Planets are considered stars in ancient terminology. In fact, the word planet comes from wandering. Well, they're wandering stars. That's what the word planet means, wanderer. They're stars that move. Most of the stars maintain their relationship relative to each other. Their distance between other stars is fixed. The planets move relative to the stars. Comets would be considered aster. They would be stars. A kind of a fuzzy star, but nonetheless. Supernovae, where a star blows itself to bits. That happens. I've seen them. They're cool. It looks like a brand new star appears, a star that you normally couldn't see. It's too faint, but it blows itself to bits and for a few months becomes brighter than the rest of the galaxy. They're very cool. They would be considered a star under the ancient system of terminology. A small moon would do it. Today we have satellites that are basically small artificial moons that orbit the Earth, and they look like little moving stars. Those would be classified as aster, as a star under the ancient system. And perhaps a close conjunction. A conjunction is where one object in the sky moves past another, usually a planet moving past a star, or occasionally a planet moving past another planet. That's called a conjunction. And if a conjunction was really close, the planet might look like it's actually combining with the star, and they might look like one star, and that could be called one star. Every one of those has been proposed as the explanation for the Christmas star. And the problem is, every one of those does not fit the text. Every one of those cannot do what the Christmas star did. The Christmas star apparently rose in the west, and again, I'm inferring that. The text doesn't come out and say that. No natural star would do that. Now, satellites would do that, but they would continue to orbit them. They wouldn't remain over Israel. No natural object, no star, planet, comet, supernova, moon, or conjunction could possibly go ahead of the wise men, go ahead of the Magi, and stand over where the child is. And if you think about it, whatever that object is, it would have to be relatively close to the surface of the earth. If it was a distant star in the heavens and it stood over where the child was, that wouldn't help you, because you're saying, okay, I think Vega is over that house. And then you get there and you say, well, now Vega's over that house, right? Because distant stars, you can't tell when you're exactly under a distant star, because if you stand here or there, you both think you're under the star. It's not going to work. I mean, it might work in a planetarium, but it's not going to work in the real sky because they're too far away. This object would have to be relatively close to the earth to know, oh, it's over this house and not that one. Or even to get you to Bethlehem as opposed to some other nearby town. None of those objects do it. None of those objects work. There is a popular DVD by a lawyer, and I think he's well-intentioned, where he proposes that it's a close conjunction of Venus and Jupiter. Because there was a close conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in the year 2 BC. And we know this because the way the planets move, today we understand that very well. And we can calculate forward and backward in time. We can calculate where the planets will be for the next 100 years. Easy, we can calculate where they were for the last 2,000 years. And sure enough, June 17th, 2 BC, Venus passed Jupiter so close that the two objects might have appeared as one star. Pretty neat. And that's been proposed as the Christmas star. But would that go ahead of the Magi and stand over where the child was? No. It's a neat phenomenon, and it did happen. The year seems wrong. 2 BC, we think Christ was born probably around 4 or 5 BC. And some people are bothered by that. Doesn't BC mean before Christ? Well, yeah, but they didn't. When they started the system, they didn't know exactly when Christ was born. But now we think it's around 4 or 5 BC. 2 BC is a little too late. It only happened once, too. Jupiter and Venus conjunct every 13 months. But the conjunction where they were so close, they appeared as one object and could be called a star as opposed to two stars, that only happened once. That only happened once, June 17th, 2 BC. It's cool, but it's a couple years after Christ was born, and it can't possibly do what the text says the Christmas star did. And some people try to say, well, the text doesn't really mean what it says. It needs to be interpreted this way, but this is historical narrative section of Scripture. It needs to be interpreted literally within the confines of the language, of course, and the culture. But certainly that wouldn't go and stand over where the child was the way the Christmas star did. So no natural object can remain suspended over Bethlehem for 2 years for the Magi to get there. And it wouldn't have had to been exactly 2 years, but close to that. So I'm going to suggest to you that the Bethlehem, the star that hovered over Bethlehem, was a supernatural light that rose over Bethlehem at Christ's birth and remained there, not particularly bright, or everybody would have seen it, but bright enough to be seen from Persia. And the Magi, being astronomers, being scholars, would have recognized it because it alone rose in the west, where all natural stars would be setting in the west over Israel. And they would have recognized that perhaps as the fulfillment of Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24:17. And so I think it's a supernatural manifestation of God's power. It could be an angel that God temporarily made visible. Angels are normally invisible spirits, but God can give them temporary bodies. He could have made a luminous one, had him hover there for 2 years. It could have been the Shekinah glory of God. That's fine. God's done that kind of thing before. God used a pillar of cloud by day and something like a flame by night to lead the Israelites. So he's done that before. That's not a problem. Could have been an inanimate object that God created simply for that temporary purpose, to lead the Magi to Christ. But it seems to have been a supernatural manifestation of God's power, and I as a Christian don't have a problem with that because I know that God is not limited to natural means. God normally uses natural means, so we're welcome to try and discover those, but when none of them apply, then that tells me God is doing something in an unusual way, and apparently he was with this particular object. Now, this explanation answers the 5 questions that people ask about this star. These questions are, first of all, why did the Magi go west? For we have seen a star in the east, so we went west. We have seen a star at its rising. And although all natural stars rise in the east, I'm going to suggest this one rose in the west. That's why they went west. They saw it rise over Israel. What made it unique? It rose in the west. No natural star does that. The only people who would have seen this star rising naturally in the east, from their perspective, would have to have been in the Mediterranean Sea. They had to have been on a boat at the time. Anybody who's on land would have seen the star rise in an unusual place, and always over Israel. So that would have been unusual. Why did only the Magi recognize it? They're experts on the sky. They would have recognized a star that doesn't belong in that constellation, and frankly, one that's going in the wrong direction. All the other stars are going down. That one came up and then just hovered there. And so they would have recognized that. But if it wasn't particularly bright, other people might not have noticed. If a new star appears in the constellation, and if it's a constellation I'm familiar with, I'm going to notice it. But if it's not particularly bright, most people wouldn't, because they're not familiar with that. It makes sense. How did they recognize it as his star? The Bible doesn't say. I'm going to suggest the answer may be Numbers 24:17. The Bible does prophesy about a star rising from Israel, and it's associated with the Messiah. It's a messianic prophecy. And so if they'd had access to Numbers 24:17, they would have said, I remember reading something about a star rising over Israel. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. There it is, Numbers 24:17. And they would have understood that's the Messiah's star. And then fifth, how did they arrive at the right house? They didn't need the star to guide them to Bethlehem. Herod told them to go to Bethlehem. They knew that's where the Christ was. How did they arrive at the right house? Because the Bible says that the star went ahead of them and stood over where the child was. So that's the one place the Christmas cards get it right, the star hovering right over the house, and the Magi arrived there. And a distant star could never do that. It would have to be one that's relatively close to the surface of the earth so you'd know which house to go to. Now, I have to point out, because people are bothered by this idea of supernatural versus natural, we understand supernatural as an unusual and extraordinary manifestation of God's power. Some people have the misconception that supernatural means God did it and natural means he didn't. That's not biblical. God does both supernatural things and natural things because he upholds all things by the word of his power. So the reason the electron continues to orbit the proton is because of God's power. In him, all things consist or hold together. That includes atoms and molecules. And you say, that's the electromagnetic force. That's the name we give to the way God does it. And so natural doesn't mean God did it. It's just the normal way God does it. Natural is the normal, consistent, predictable way God upholds his creation and accomplishes his will. My point is, supernatural and natural are equally manifestations of God's power. One we take for granted because it happens all the time. We don't think of a sunrise as being from God, but it is. It's just because it happens every day, we take it for granted. You know, if you saw a bird grow off of a tree and then fly away, you'd say, that's a miracle. But food literally grows on trees, and we take that for granted, right? So natural is the normal, consistent way God upholds his will. But God is not required to do things that way. And there are certain events in history that seem to be unusual and extraordinary manifestations of God's power, like the resurrection of Christ. That's something that I accept, not on the basis that I can repeat it under scientific conditions, because nobody's going to be able to do that. It's something only God can do. There are no natural conditions that will generate a resurrection in a human being that's been dead for 3 days. But God can do what he wants. And so we accept on the basis of Scripture that this event happened, and it happened the way the Bible describes. And so my conclusion is that his star, the star of the Messiah, was likely a unique supernatural manifestation of God's power to indicate the birth and location of Christ. And the account is significant. The account is significant. The people who should have been looking for the Messiah, the majority of them missed him. The majority of Jews didn't respond. Now, some of them got saved later, right? I mean, Peter preaches a sermon in Acts 2, and many Jews come to Christ, and that's great. God hasn't forgotten the Jews. There's no doubt about that. But the majority of them rejected him, and it was Gentiles from a pagan nation that you'd think, well, they have no right to the gospel, but God was gracious to them too. It shows that God cares about Jews and Gentiles, and God used the rebellion of the Jews to bring salvation to the Gentiles. The Magi were perhaps the first people to see that. They got to see the face of God because they responded to the light, and I think that's wonderful. So we do have this presentation on DVD, his star, along with a lot of other resources in the back. I hope you'll get some of those. Again, I want to recommend The Ultimate Proof of Creation, which shows you how to think and debate biblically. If you've ever wanted to learn to debate the way Jesus did, that's the book for you. Because Jesus is not the kind of person you wanted to debate against, believe me. He was very good at it. And you can get pretty good at it too. You won't be as good as the Lord, but you can get pretty good at it if you learn to think like him. We have that on DVD as well. Understanding Genesis. How do we know that God really meant 6 days when he said 6 days? We do know that. There's no doubt about it. We have a DVD on that and a book that goes into detail on that, Understanding Genesis. Taking Back Astronomy, how the universe refutes a Big Bang in billions of years and things like that. We have a DVD that goes along with that called Astronomy Reveals Creation. Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky. If you'd like to learn how things move in the night sky, how natural objects move, that's the book for you. And you'll get good enough. I teach this. I used to teach a college course at Masters University. I do it in the wind term class. And by the end of the class, the students knew how to calculate when the moon would rise and set roughly. I mean, you can do it in your head. We don't have to get the exact time, but they say, okay, tonight the moon's in this phase. It'll rise around this time and set around that time. You can do that stuff, and it's pretty neat. You just have to kind of understand how things move and why they move that way. So that's a fun book. If you want to get a telescope, what kind you might want to get and how to use it. So that's Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky. Keeping Faith in an Age of Reason answers over 400 alleged Bible contradictions. The critics say this verse contradicts that one. It doesn't. I checked. And the answers are in that book. You can even have that just as a reference book on your shelf. If somebody asks about an alleged contradiction, there's over 400 listed in there. And I've got the answer to that, and you can see that. Most of them, they just didn't read the text very carefully, by the way. Kind of interesting. Discerning Truth, how to answer the most common fallacies that evolutionists make when they try to defend evolution. Introduction to Logic, how to use your mind rightly into the glory of God. And again, we have a teacher's guide for that with tests and quizzes and an answer key if you want to test your logical fallacy detection skills. The Physics of Einstein, if you've ever wondered about what all that's about, and is time travel possible, and what about black holes, and how did God get the light from those distant galaxies to the earth in the biblical time frame. It's all covered in that book. Worlds of Creation takes you on a tour of the solar system, shows you how each of the worlds of creation demonstrates God's glory and not billions of years or secularism. Dinosaurs in the Bible, that's just a fun one. Secret Code of Creation, I think I did this one the last time I was here. It's the one on fractals, which shows you how God has built beauty into an aspect of creation most people don't even think about. We now have a book on that as well. In fact, we have the hardcover. Now, I think we just had the soft cover last time. So the hardcover, they brighten the colors a little bit. It's really pretty. You can get the best of our books together for 20% discount, the best of our DVDs for 20% discount, or our library pack for a 30% discount. And don't forget to sign up for our free monthly newsletter. Just make sure you put your email address every now and then I'll see one, they leave no email address. You're getting nothing, sorry. It's an email, so make sure you sign up for that, and it'll keep you up to date on what we're doing and where we're going to be. And check us out on the web as well, biblicalscienceinstitute.com. We're going to take a 10-minute book buying break, and then we'll come back and talk about the James Webb Space Telescope. Thank you much.